My name is Peter Martinson. Thank you for having me up here. I'm going to give a presentation on some of the deeper implications of the NAWAPA project. Jean-Philippe went through some of the technical challenges and why we have to construct such a vast, huge project. I mean, some people in here might have some idea of how big this project is. It is vast. It's enormous. It would be the largest construction project that humanity had ever undertaken, ever, and probably for a long time after that. So I'm going to go through some of the deeper implications. First, what I want to do is give a sense from the States, from your neighbor in America. I work directly with Lyndon LaRouche down in Virginia. I'm part of what's called his basement project. I work with several other people, and it functions as a type of a research and development core for the movement in order to make clear what are the scientific and technological challenges for the future and what types of projects do we have to move towards undertaking immediately in order to save civilization. And I'll say that right now, Mr. LaRouche we're living in the middle of what I'd call Mr. LaRouche's last forecast. He's an economist by trade, and he happens to be the best economic forecaster that we know of. I don't know of any person before Mr. LaRouche or since his birth that has been as successful as him in making economic forecasts. And we're living in his last one right now. His forecast is that we are in extreme danger of collapse of civilization now, that our enemy on this planet is the British Empire as a system. It really takes the form of the sovereign nation state, which the best example of this, the most successful example of this, is the United States. It's the United States system, the nation state system, versus the British Empire. And we're at the point now where the decision as to whether we survive or the British Empire prevails but then all of civilization collapses could be made by Christmas, all right, which is very soon. Yeah, check your calendars. Mark that on your calendar. So we're living in this situation now, and I'm going to go through just a couple of quick points from what's happening down in the United States, in Europe, and just a sense of what's happening worldwide to kind of put some meat on that concept. Let's see. I'll say that in the U.S. we're living in it's kind of a window. In the beginning of November we had an election down there where we elected a whole new slate of people for our Congress. Several new senators were elected, and it was represented as a change from a Democrat-controlled Congress to a Republican-controlled Congress. What it really was, on the one hand, the population saw it as the people have spoken. We hate Obama. Obama's one of the worst presidents that the United States has ever had so far. He's only been in there for, what, a year and a half, 2 years, or 1 year. He hasn't been in there for very long, but so far he's the worst that we've had. People are saying, if only we had George Bush back, if only we had W back as the president. So the election was played off as the people have spoken. We've wiped out the Democrats who are pissing us off because of Obama, and we brought in the Republicans that we support, which is characterized by this group in the United States called the Tea Party group, which is, as a group, it's not of very much historical consequence. There's not much to them. They come across as patriots. A lot of people got involved with these groups because they don't know what to do. They see that the United States is collapsing economically, and we want to do something, and the Tea Party looked like something as a group that was organizing. But the people that were voted into office are into the House of Representatives are in large part worse than Obama. People like, for example, Rand Paul, this guy from Tennessee who's a piece of junk. Some people might know who his father is. But these guys promote a form of economics which is it's called rabid austerity, severe austerity, where the idea is that the government should no longer support the welfare of the population, that you have to save money in order to balance the budget of the nation. Now, we recognize this as a symptom of what LaRouche has pointed at back in the 1920s and 30s in Germany. All right, this is the type of thinking of Adolf Hitler, which himself, in turn, was a project of the British Empire to crush Europe, to crush Germany particularly, to crush the power of any other country that could oppose the British Empire. So what we're seeing in the United States is a window. It's called lame duck session. These new representatives don't come into power until January. So the old representatives are still in there. It's a short period of time until we get these new guys in. But the new composition of the Congress, the composition of the White House, will be predominantly fascist, but more so a puppet government of the British Empire. So that's partially why Mr. LaRouche says we have a very short period of time. Now, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, we have Europe, which most people know is undergoing some serious tumult. There's a lot of emphasis on Ireland over the past couple of weeks. People have seen Ireland in the news as potentially destroying the European Union system. Now, we see this as a very good thing. Now, you look, Ireland is one of the smallest countries in the world. All right, it's off the coast of England, and it's one of the core nations, one of the core countries inside of the British Empire itself. And the British see themselves as, the Irish should really do what we tell them to do. But the Irish tend to have a streak of revolution in them against the British, which is very healthy. And over the past several weeks, over the past month, the Irish had a chance, and there was a big fight. They had a chance to take down the British Empire. This little tiny country, all right, there's not a lot of people in Ireland, but it's feisty, and it was in a position where it could have taken down the whole empire by itself. Then obviously we would need the policies to get out of the tumult that would come out of that. But taking down the British Empire is the right thing to do. We need to get rid of the British Empire pronto, right away. So we have a situation worldwide where the United States, there is some hope in the United States in the form of what we're doing. Worldwide, there is some fight against the British Empire. But unless we take down the British Empire very soon, there will be little hope for humanity. And as Mr. LaRouche has said, you better find another planet to live on pretty soon. Perhaps Mars, although it's not very hospitable there yet. So that's the situation that we've got right now. It's very dangerous. Now, my role in the basement, Mr. LaRouche looks at us as a type of science core, and he puts us onto specific projects which he thinks are important and useful for the future of humanity. One was the NAWAPA project. He started the organizing around NAWAPA, the recent phase of it, in the basement. And it's not as, I assume most people in here know some of the basics of NAWAPA, if not from Jean-Philippe's presentation, from things that you've read, videos that we put out. Mr. LaRouche wanted us to look at the NAWAPA project not as an engineering project, which, as you can see, is very extensive, but as an investigation of how mankind shapes the biosphere. How is it that mankind, as a power that's higher than the abiotic and higher than biology itself, how is it that man shapes the biosphere to improve it, the entire globe's biosphere, to improve it, but also to improve it for the rest of the life on the planet, and as a type of a university system for developing Mars and other planets in the solar system. So what I'm going to be going through in this presentation is an investigation of how NAWAPA and the related infrastructure projects will relate to is a type of a university system, and with specific emphasis on the Arctic, this region up here, and you know, the northern parts of the country, because most of the population right now in Canada, as you all know, live down here, live relatively near the border, right? There's not a lot of people up north, but the northern parts of the North American continent are absolutely fascinating. And as I'll show, that's the area on the planet that that is the connection point between the Earth and the rest of the solar system and the rest of the galaxy and our intergalactic system. And that life as we know it on the Earth is an intergalactic phenomena. And I'll show this. To understand it more and more deeply, we have to engage in the NAWAPA and the related types of engineering projects, because otherwise we won't run into the types of problems that we need to run into in order to make the types of discoveries that we have to discover. And I'll make this clear in just a couple of minutes. So I'll just start. Now, Mr. LaRouche is the best economist in the world, and it's not because he's made a killing on the stock market or he's like the best investor in derivatives or anything like that. He's the best economist in the world because he understands that economics is not based on how you fix the books. It's not based on how much money you can move around or anything like that. He understands the basis of the principles of economics, which has been developed through a continuous train of thought since the Greeks. And today, there are very few people that understand this. LaRouche is the best. But I'm going to go through the core principle of economics. Human beings use resources, right? Like a lot of people are focused today on how much oil we use. I don't know exactly how this plays out in Canada, but in the United States, there's a whole movement designed around stopping our dependence on oil in the Middle East. Right? We use resources. Water. Water is an extremely valuable resource in North America as a whole right now. Anybody who lives in these regions that Jean-Philippe just discussed knows that water is possibly the most important resource. We use resources. Now, we use resources up. There's not an infinite amount of water in various areas of the planet. So you can drain a lake, for example. You can lower levels of rivers. We use these resources. What we tend to do, water is not the only resource. We also have other resources like iron, for example. Around the Great Lakes region, for example, there are high concentrations of iron deposits near around Ontario, around Lake Superior, around here. Very highly dense concentrations of iron. As human beings, we tend to hunt out those sources of resources that are the most dense. Take coal, for example. We look for the types of coal that burn the hottest and the cleanest. And we use that first. We tend to use that first. So human beings use resources. We use the most dense sources of those resources until we deplete them. We take the resources, we use the densest concentrations, and we move to less and less and less dense concentrations of the same resources. So when we use them, we disperse the resources and make them less dense. But at the same time, we're using the most dense concentrations of resources. And so we move to less and less dense. So you could extrapolate this and say, well, we're going to use everything up. Right? We're going to use up all the resources on the Earth. And then what are we going to do? We're going to do like animals do. Right? Our population is going to reach that'll be the maximum population, and our population is going to collapse because we just can't support the people anymore because we don't have those resources anymore. Like some people are saying out in the prairie areas, central United States and so forth, well, we just have too many people in these areas. We're farming too much. Therefore, we're using up all the water. So we need to cut back on water usage, right? People have seen signs and so forth saying, please don't use so much water because we have drought period and things like that. So were we animals, were we simply animals, we would reach a limit of resource utilization which would represent an upper boundary of our population on the planet, or in the area that you're referencing. And what a typical animal population would do at that point is either move to another place that has resources, if you can do that, or the population will begin to collapse through things like disease, starvation, whatever. The population tends to collapse because creatures depend on resources. Now, so we call this depletion. Now the question is, are we really animals? What happens when we reach a point of having less and less resources and lower concentrations of resources? That puts a pressure on our population. Do we respond as animals? This is the core principle of economics. We are human beings. We are not animals. We are a higher order of existence in the universe than simple biology. What we do is we make possible the use of new resources. First, we take something that used to be a rock, and we create technology which makes that seeming rock, which was in the way and you were trying to get it off your farm before so you can farm on it. We take that rock and we convert it into something that's useful by creating a technology that can use it. For example, uranium used to be a rock. It was you didn't want this stuff on your land. It was not useful at all. But at some point, through a heavy investment into development of science and technology in several countries, this wasn't just the United States, this was an international project, we learned how to use things like uranium, plutonium, and other resources which were completely unusable before. So first, human beings create technologies to use new resources. Second, so that's what you do when you start running out of resources. That's one way to get around that. But the other more deep function of man is that we create new technologies which apply the power at what's called higher and higher energy flux densities. So you take the same resources, possibly less and less concentrated resources, like coal that burns, not as hot as other coal, and you create a new technology which uses the same resource but applies it at higher energy flux density. So you get more work out of less dense resources than you did before. Now, where did this ability come from? And we've seen this over and over in the history of man. Mr. LaRouche continuously references just the types of power that we use, starting with simple wind power, up to using water power, up to using burning wood, burning charcoal, burning coal, burning oil, then finally burning uranium in nuclear fission, and the potential of nuclear fusion power, which is right on the horizon. If we would mobilize our forces, we could make breakthroughs in fusion power very rapidly. So we move to higher and higher energy flux densities. What does that represent? Does that represent something that Rex the dog could do? Obviously not. This is a function of human creative technology, or human creative willful discovery. The survival of the human species depends on the principle of creativity that exists only in man. And the end result, the representation of using your creative abilities to make new scientific discoveries, to increase the energy flux density that man can apply, has as an effect an increase in the amount of population that you can support per unit of land. Mr. LaRouche calls this potential relative population density. Some people in here might be familiar with some of this stuff. But the representation of the act of creativity is an increase in the number of people that can be supported per unit of land, per hectare, per capita. Now, this is a big difference between human beings and animals. In animal species, a species of bird will get to a certain point and then there will be a limit on the population. And no bird is going to make a discovery of how to make more birdseed or something like that. No school of fish will ever make a discovery of how to increase the amount of plankton that they can produce so that they can eat and support a larger population. No animal can do that. Only human beings. Now, back in the early parts of the 20th century, this distinction between man and simple biology was made by a Russian biogeochemist named Vladimir Vernadsky. Let me see if I can find this picture for you. Okay, Vladimir Vernadsky, very, very famous Russian-Ukrainian biogeochemist. He discovered the distinction first between simple biology, which he called the biosphere, and what's called variously the geosphere, the lithosphere, the abiotic, that which is not living. And what Vernadsky, a lot of people talk about Vernadsky today. You run into people talking about his concept of the biosphere. Everybody in here has heard the term biosphere, I suspect. They take it kind of out of context because Vernadsky wasn't just saying that life is different than non-life, that life is like way more complicated than simple chemistry, but that life itself represented a physical space-time in the sense of Einstein's physical space-time that's distinct from non-life. In other words, non-life cannot exist in a physical space-time of life. The matter which is inside of living organisms, such as plants, animals, bacteria, and so forth, that matter is a different form of matter than you find inside of a rock, inside of a chemistry experiment, inside of anything that's in a non-living domain. The physical space-time itself is different, and therefore the properties of matter are different. And we see this all over the place. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. We can discuss some of it in the question and answers. So Vernadsky made the point that biology, the biosphere, and the lithosphere, the biotic and the abiotic, are two distinct phases of space-time. And later on in his life, he recognized that the creative abilities of man, which are represented in things like the construction of infrastructure, he said especially the utilization of isotopes and the full nuclear processing cycle, which was just coming online during his time and which he promoted. That's a representation that man himself represents a third physical space-time that's distinct from the living space-time and the non-living space-time. And so Mr. LaRouche puts an important point on the whole thing. He says that the universe is a creative universe as a whole, as a totality. He says it's it's an unbounded universe. It's not bounded by anything. It's a totality of a creative universe. But that creativity, as a willful creativity, is expressed only in man. You see the creativity of the universe expressed in the other two domains, in the abiotic and the biotic. But in those domains, it's involuntary. It's not willful. But in man, human beings have the ability of making a discovery, a creative discovery, that's a new discovery, and then applying that willfully to change the universe in a creative direction. And I'll give examples of this for both the abiotic and the biotic. In short, in the abiotic, Mr. LaRouche has pointed several times to the problem of the periodic table of elements. That if you had an early sun, billions of years ago, we think there was only the sun in our solar system. There was no other, the planets didn't exist, and so forth. There was just a sun spinning super quickly. At some point, according to best knowledge today, the sun flung off matter into a disk around itself, which then arranged itself in what's called fractional distillation, where you have different types of matter organizing itself in rings around the sun. And you see things like fractional distillation when you do petroleum work. You distill the different types of the different types, like the gas goes to the top, the crude oil is at the bottom, and so forth. So early on, the sun organized around itself a fractionally distilled sequence of matter, which only went up to iron in the periodic table. So that's only like 30 elements down the line, nothing heavier than that. But then something happened within those rings, which had to be some type of a nuclear fusion process to begin combining the material for higher and higher weights of atomic species, all the way up through uranium, which is element number 92. It's a very, very dense, heavy element. So Mr. LaRouche said some type of fusion process had to occur, which was not based simply on driving, hypothetical atoms together as hard as you can, but there was something which he calls polarized fusion, which is more along the lines of a creative process of combining matter to make heavier and heavier forms, so that we have the full spectrum of the periodic table in our solar system today. You mine uranium from the ground, right? There are areas in Africa which have very high concentrations of uranium. They're called natural nuclear reactors. There's evidence that these concentrations of uranium got so concentrated early on that you actually had a nuclear reaction begin. All right, such places in Gabon, I think, a place called Okolo, which was, all the evidence is that you had essentially a nuclear reactor going for a long period of time in the ground. These are areas that we mine uranium today. So early on in the history of our solar system, there was the creative act of creating what's necessary for the development of the planets, specifically one planet, which I tend to be partial to, which is our planet, because it's a very special place in the universe. Okay, so our solar system is a result of not a downgrading, not of something that's churning down, going downwards in energy or organization or whatever you want to call it. It's a result of an upshift, an anti-entropic upshift of organization in our solar system. Abiotic. And the biotic, something that we've been looking at a lot. Very interesting. And we produced a video on this just recently called the Extraterrestrial Imperative Part 2, which goes through some of this. Very, very interesting. And I'm going to describe it for you now because it's very, very important. Life on the Earth. You have a dogma today, which is a big problem. I forget whether it was this year or last year was the Great Darwin Year. Does anybody know? Last year, the Great Darwin Year, right, where it was a celebration of Charles Darwin, British scientist, who had some talent. He's an intelligent guy, but his hypotheses were turned into a dogma that's controlled biology ever since, transformed into a dogma by forces in the British Empire. We can go through some of the names of these people if you guys want. But the Darwin idea that really what you have in the development of life on the Earth is that every animal fights for its survival, which in one way or another, of course, is true. All right? You have to find food and stuff like that. But that the evolution of life on the Earth is a result of every single act by every single animal ever in the history of the Earth, whether or not that animal survived, whether or not that animal had some different characteristic inside of its biology that gave it the edge against all the other animals around it. That if that animal was a little bit better, which in one sense is actually an arbitrary judgment of whether something is better or not in that sense, that animal will live. The other ones that are less developed will die, and that one will go on and find a mate, and they'll procreate and live happily ever after until the next more advanced creature comes along, which might be millions of years down the line, and it happens again. And so millions and millions, hundreds, billions of years have gone by, supposedly, with an adding up of all of these little changes in organisms, which has led up to us. According to Darwin, we're the result, essentially a random result of these tiny little evolutionary upshifts. Now, this this is a dogma. This is not true. And some research that's come out in the past couple of years is making this more and more clear. And there's actually a lot of ferment right now in paleontology, genetics, and all these aspects of science that deal with this type of investigation. There is a ferment to say, we have to overthrow this Darwinian dogma because there's evidence coming out that shows that it just can't be true. And I'll go through one aspect of that evidence now. The idea that's coming out now, and honestly it's not a new idea, this has been around for decades, centuries in fact, is that the development of life on the Earth, which has developed over a long time, and we got an old planet here. I'll show you this just to give a sense of the scale. It doesn't really matter if you can't read it. The point is that you have geologists have determined that you can categorize types of rock layers by how old they are, depending on whether one layer is above another. And so it's taken, tens of thousands of geologists centuries to develop this type of a scale, which shows up here is the most recent period. It's called the Cenozoic era. And it goes backwards in time. This one goes down to about 550 million years ago, at the beginning of what's called the Cambrian period. People know, the dinosaurs lived in this little kind of brownish period here called the Mesozoic, from 65 million years ago to 250 million years ago. And then before that was a whole different, a whole new set of species, a whole new set of rocks, etc. And then before this, 550 million years ago, there's about 3.5 billion years more of rock that we know of on the Earth. The oldest rock that we know of is about 4 billion years old. And just as a side note, we found evidence of life in every single one of these rocks, going all the way back to the earliest rock on the Earth. All right, relatively advanced photosynthetic life, all right, relatively advanced life. Now, in the past period, this idea has come about that the development of animals and organisms, plants, etc. on the Earth is something that's not driven by something internal to the organism, but it's driven by external influences. And I'll just point at two of these. One in particular. Looks like this. Okay. So let me just. Okay, this is a graph which was produced within the past 5 years by a couple of scientists down in Kansas and in California. It's a graph of the blue line. They took essentially everything we know about all of the fossil organisms that have existed on the Earth. And there are several catalogs of these types of organisms. There are surveys. You can actually get some of these things online. If people are interested, I can tell you how to get it. But what you can do is, in each bracket of time, starting from 500 million years ago, here, all the way up until today, you can graph out essentially how many orders of animals existed at any block of time. So, so going above means an increase in number of organisms. The blue curve is essentially the number of different distinct types of organisms that existed at those times. So back at the end of the dinosaur period, right about here, there was a dramatic collapse in the number of organisms on the Earth, and the number of types of organisms. So some people, I know a lot of different types of people. Let's say most of them got wiped out, and you knew only like 2 different types of people. That's what happened right about here, the collapse of the dinosaurs and everything else. So there's very few types of organisms that existed at that point. Beforehand, there was a dramatic increase in number of organisms, number of types of organisms. But these guys down in California and Kansas recognized something that they did a big investigation of, which is that in this, if you look all the way back at 550 million years up until today and look at the number of distinct types of organisms that existed, there's a cycle. There's an increase and a decrease, increase and a decrease. And you can see it. Decrease, increase, decrease, increase, increase, decrease. It goes up and down. Does everybody see that? I mean, there's some blips, right? You have a little blip there. It's not absolutely perfect, but it's a cycle nonetheless. Now, what these guys did is they came up with, they looked at, okay, this cycle, which is about 62 million years cycle, from peak to peak, takes about 62 million years, give or take 2 million years or so, between 60 and 65 million years. Are there other cycles that we know of that have that period, that take that amount of time to go, essentially maximum to minimum, maximum to minimum? One cycle that they found, which is their actually best hypothesis of what cycle coincides with this one, is not, Darwin predicted this, but it's this. Okay, we live inside of a galaxy. All right, according to the best estimates right now, we live inside of a galaxy. We live on the outskirts of the galaxy. Right, we live, outside of town, on the outskirts, out in the sprawl somewhere, out in the boonies. And we're orbiting the center of our galaxy over a long period of time. It takes several hundred million years to make one orbit around our galaxy, on the order of 1 billion years, to make one full orbit of the center of our galaxy. But as we orbit, our planet, hopefully people can see this, our planet, as it's orbiting, bobs up and down through the plane of the galaxy. All right? So sometimes we're down here, and sometimes we're up here, and back and forth, over and over and over and over, on a period of about 62 million years. So at one point we're here on the top of our galaxy, and we start dipping down, and then we come back up to reach here 62 million years later. Right? Now, it turns out that our galaxy is not in the middle of nowhere. There's more to the universe than the Milky Way galaxy. There is a whole supercluster of galaxies that we're part of, most of which are up here. Down here, there's actually not very many galaxies that we know of. I didn't bring a map of where we think the galaxies are, but most of the galaxies we know of are in what's called the Virgo cluster. So if you look towards the constellation Virgo with a super powerful telescope, you'll start to see a lot of galaxies which are relatively close to our galaxy. They're inside of what's called our supercluster, our local supercluster of galaxies, the local group of galaxies. These galaxies, which are, for the most part, all these Virgo cluster galaxies are on one side of our galaxy. So when we dip below, we're essentially blocked from the effects of those galaxies. But when we come back above the plane of our galaxy, all of a sudden we're face to face with this other supercluster, with whatever they're flinging at us, whatever is happening, whatever effects are coming from that supercluster. We no longer have the protection of the disk of our own galaxy. But then when we go back underneath again, we're protected. Now, the hypothesis of these scientists that noticed the correlation between the two cycles, and actually the red cycle is the cycle of us going above and below the plane of our galaxy. They hypothesized that, well, what's happening is that we have matter that enters the Earth system, enters the solar system, and then finally enters our atmosphere, which are called galactic cosmic rays. And this is actually an old idea. We started discovering the existence of cosmic rays in the early 20th century, back in the 1920s and 1930s. And we find that the flux, the amount of those cosmic rays, goes up and down relative to this cycle. So in other words, when we're above the galaxy, above the plane of the galaxy, we're getting essentially impacted by a much higher flux of galactic cosmic rays coming from the Virgo cluster of galaxies than we do when we're underneath, hidden from view of those other galaxies. So there's a change, more or less, more and less, more and less cosmic rays hitting the Earth. Now their hypothesis is, they have several hypotheses of what these cosmic rays do to organisms. Some say, well, the more cosmic rays we have hitting the Earth, the more cloud cover we'll have, and thus the deeper ice ages we'll have, which affects organisms. But the hypotheses themselves at this point are interesting. They're not necessarily the proof nailed to the board. But what is nailed to the board is the cycle itself. It's an intergalactic cycle which coincides very closely with the pattern of biodiversity on the Earth. Now, a somewhat fainter, this is secondary, a somewhat fainter pattern is actually seen to be on a 140 million year cycle, which another scientist pointed out is the same cycle as the sun orbits the galaxy. These spiral arms actually stay put. They stay where they are. So our planet actually goes through spiral arms. Every 144 years, every 144 million years, we pass through another spiral arm. And so there's an echo of that also in the diversity of life on the Earth. So what this illustrates is that life on the Earth is not a thing internal to life on the Earth, but that life on the Earth somehow coincides with cycles that are not even centered inside of our own solar system or in our own galaxy, but are centered within a whole supercluster of galaxies. Therefore, life as we know it on the Earth is galactic. Okay, Darwin has got to go out the window for this one. Now, what Vernadsky made clear, and then Mr. LaRouche puts a fine point on and emphasized over and over and over, is that life itself is a universal physical principle. That the universe is organized according to creativity towards higher and higher orderings of processes in the whole universe. And that represents itself in life as an active, developing system. So what we see with this system of cycles is that life is not located on the Earth, but that life is an intergalactic creative system. Because at the same time that you have increases and decreases of biodiversity, you have increases every single time of the type of the advantages that life has on the Earth. Newer organisms. For example, 500-some million years ago, the creation of calcium skeletons was initiated. Right? That was a serious act of life on the Earth. Because without skeletons, you can't have higher organisms. You can't develop a central nervous system. You can't develop things like speech. You can't develop things like lifting things up. Right? So skeletons were a very important development on the Earth. Things like photosynthesis was an important development, and other things. There's been an upward development of the types of life on the Earth, and at the same time a crafting of the environment of the Earth to make way for even yet higher and higher types of organisms, like going from cold-blooded organisms to warm-blooded organisms, which seems like that was one of the big transitions during the period of the dinosaurs. It was a transition to warm-blooded creatures, which can now go and live in places like the Arctic, right? Because they're more active. They don't have to sit and hope that the sun comes out so that they get some energy to move around. Warm-blooded organisms are more energy dense. It's in fact a higher energy flux density of organism. So in life you see a creative principle developing. Now, as Mr. LaRouche made the point with our comrade Vernadsky, creativity is inherent in the universe as a whole, but man himself is the only willfully creative organism that we know of. Organisms themselves, regular biology develops in a creative direction, but no organism itself is going to be creative and make some kind of new breakthrough. All right? The development in life is involuntary relative to the organism, but it's creative across the species, across the whole biosphere. The biosphere itself is creative, but no individual organism is creative. Man himself is willfully creative. So, all right. Now what we're going to look at is NAWAPA and the development of infrastructure relative to the Arctic. Has anybody here ever been up to the Arctic? Some people have. Yeah. A little bit below. Okay, here is. Whoop. Ugh. Okay, this is what people usually think of when they think Arctic, right? It's really, really cold and icy up there, right? And there's been a lot of hoopla recently about how the Arctic ice is starting to disappear and so forth. And the reports are, it actually depends on who you ask relative to whether the ice sheet is actually getting thicker or we're losing ice or the ice cap is getting smaller or whatnot. Most of the evidence actually says that we're headed towards maximums of ice sheet cover in the North Pole and not a declining ice cover like some of the environmentalists say. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that the ice sheet is actually getting thinner and disappearing in the north. But most evidence actually says that we're getting more and more ice. Anyhow, when people think about the Arctic, they think, oh, it's just a bunch of ice. You can't do anything up there. You need to have Russian nuclear icebreakers in order to get anywhere up there. Or else know how to make good igloos. But this is the Arctic without the ice. Now, what you see here, people have probably seen this picture before. Here's Greenland, which is a Danish territory. Here's your own country, Canada. Here is Russia, all the way out to here. And then you have Scandinavia over here, Norway, etc. Now, the development of NAWAPA, if you look at a map of it, most of NAWAPA seems to occur down here, right in the lower latitudes. And some people say, well, the United States is going to get all that water, so really the benefit is for them, right? The United States is going to steal Canadian water. But the reality is that most of the rainfall on North America occurs up near the Arctic, up in the northern territories and Alaska. Fully half of the rainfall on North America occurs in Alaska, the Yukon, British Columbia, and the northern part of northwestern United States, northwest corner. Half or more than half of all the rainfall on the whole continent occurs in that little tiny area, all right? And then it immediately runs off into the ocean. Now, what NAWAPA proposes is to take 20% of that rainfall and bring it down into the continent. All right, now 20% seems like not a lot of the rainfall, but the fact is that that's so much water that I don't think anybody in here can imagine how much water that is. Maybe a couple of you can imagine, but it's so much water that it boggles the mind. 160 million acre feet, if anybody cares to ask. But anyhow, most of the rainfall happens in the northern parts of our continent. Part of the development of NAWAPA means developing reservoir systems and dam systems up in this northern part of Alaska and Yukon, and then up here in northern British Columbia, and also areas around here, which will be somewhat easier construction than up in these remote parts up there, which means the necessity of developing rail lines into the north. All right. These are the black ones are the existing rail lines of North America that we know of. All right. There's a Canadian National Railway, American Railway, Mexico, and some of this may exist. Some of it, I don't think exists. There's a plan right now to develop what's called the Alaska-Canada Rail Link. Some people might know about that, which is an ongoing study now, just recently, since 2007. They're completing the study very soon and will begin construction rather soon, which is this dark red part here. This rail line in Alaska does not exist yet. This rail line up in the Northern Territories doesn't exist. And up here in Nunavut, is that how you say it? Obviously doesn't exist yet. We'll need to build all of this rail in order to develop the NAWAPA system. But if you look, all the new rail essentially is going to be in the Arctic. All the core new rail systems, besides just repairing and connecting already existing rail routes, most of the new rail will be built in the Arctic. Why? Who cares about the Arctic? Right? There's not a lot of people up there and it's too cold. Well, it turns out that the Arctic is one of the most dense concentrations of raw material of resources in the world. Right? If you ask the Russians this, they'll say Siberia is the most dense area in the world. You know, who's counting? It's the Arctic. Right? The Arctic is the densest place on the planet of resources. Let me see. This is just a little schematic. This comes from the Geological Survey of Canada. It's just some of the areas of already being developed mineral resources. Some people might know, do people realize that Canada used to be the top exporter of uranium on the planet? Up until just last year, and Kazakhstan took over. But there's a ton of uranium in this area, also up north. Now, one of the problems with the Arctic is that it's difficult to get around. There's not a lot of infrastructure. There's not a lot of transportation. We know that there are tons of deposits of resources such as uranium, radium, other types of radioactive resources. Rare earth elements are up there. Gold, of course, there's a lot of gold up there. A lot of copper, zinc, lead, tons and tons in the Arctic, which at this point is not able to be developed because you don't have the power or the transportation to get up there. And it takes a lot of water, incidentally, to perform mining operations. Now, there has been a lot of surveying up in this area, but not as much development as there could be. Another thing to point out is down in the States, our U.S. Geological Society did another survey just in 2008, which illustrates, it's a study of how much oil there is in above the Arctic Circle. Okay, so Russia, Canada, Greenland, Scandinavia. This might be a little bit difficult to understand. All right, here's Greenland. Here's Canada, all the way around to here is the border with Alaska, so here's Alaska. And then here's Russia, all the way over here. And then Scandinavia is over here, Norway. And then you've got the Atlantic Ocean coming in here. But the darker colors represent estimated, the darker the color, the more estimate of petroleum exists under the ground in those areas, okay? So, northern Canada, the Arctic, tons. Siberia, tons. Northern Alaska, tons. Up into the ocean, tons. If you'll notice, there's not a lot in this area, which is because it's difficult to do surveying in those areas, all right, under the ice cap. Some would wish that the ice cap would melt so we can actually get up there and do some work. which I'm not proposing we should do. But oil, petroleum, there's tons of petroleum up in this area. Why are there so many resources in the Arctic? Why not where we can get them? Okay, the other thing about the Arctic, actually this is actually funny, is that, this is just kind of a side note, but the Arctic tends to be a driver of climate on the Earth. Back in the earlier part of last century, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, the Russians came up with this wild idea, just to give you a sense of the power of the Arctic regions and the importance of developing it. You just look at the map. The Arctic is almost a closed area. There's one large opening here, where a lot of the water from the Atlantic Ocean can rush in, warmer waters. And then there's this little tiny blip right here, which is the Bering Strait, which is a very, very skinny area. I forget, it's on the order of 100 kilometers. Some Russian scientists proposed back in the early 20th century to put a dam across the Bering Strait, to put a dam that you can control water flows back and forth across the dam, with the idea that if we could control the water flow, we could prevent water from the Pacific Ocean, which is cold water, from going into the Bering Strait, or going through the Bering Strait into the Arctic Circle, and instead promote warmer Atlantic waters to go into the Arctic Ocean, which would then warm up the ocean and melt the ice cap. And there are all these economic benefits that will come out of melting the ice cap, like shipping. We could do massive amounts of shipping in the area. You could do drilling and things like that of the continental shelf. And they decided not to do it because there were a lot of scares of whether or not this would actually cause an immediate initiation. Because you melt the Arctic, the polar ice cap, that water is going to evaporate and go somewhere, which will tend to come down as moisture over the continent and create tons and tons of rain and snowfall, and potentially lower the temperatures over the continents and spark a new global ice age, which we don't necessarily want to do. So just a hint. The North is one of the drivers of the climate. So if we control the Arctic, we can modify the climate of the entire planet. This is an indication of the power that we could have over entire globes, and specifically other planets like Mars, which we have to go to and create, maybe not the whole planet, but at least some of the planet, the ability for organisms to survive and thrive. Okay, then the third aspect of the Arctic, I actually don't have an image of this. People in here have seen the aurora borealis, the so-called northern lights, right? This represents the fact that the North is a very, very special place on the Earth. Because the aurora borealis, according to what we know about them, and some people actually hear the aurora. Anybody in here ever heard the aurora before? Nobody's ever heard it? Some people do. They hear it like crackling cellophane or something like that, even though it's hundreds of miles away. The aurora, according to the best idea today, is composed of matter from the sun, which has been locked up into our magnetic field of the Earth and becomes condensed in the Arctic. It also happens down in the south. There are actually southern lights too, but it's not as pronounced as in the actual Arctic in the north. It gets condensed and then begins to glow, and it creates these sheets of electromagnetic phenomena that are fascinating, but that's matter from the sun, all right? Our planet is surrounded by a very, very powerful magnetic field. Some people have been outside with a compass before, and you do navigation according to a compass to tell you what direction the North Pole is. So you've experienced the magnetic field of the Earth. Birds, we know, navigate according to the magnetic field of the Earth. Whales navigate according to the magnetic field. Bats migrate. Insects are very sensitive to the magnetic field, and so forth. A lot of organisms are sensitive to the ebbs and flow of the power of the magnetic field, which happens on a solar day. But the northern parts of the globe act as a type of a funnel. You have things like cosmic rays aiming towards the planet Earth. when they run into our magnetic field, they run into a very complicated phenomena where a lot of these cosmic rays get deflected off the Earth, or get deflected and become locked up into the magnetic field but never make it down to the ground until they become filtered up to the poles. All right? That becomes the northern lights. So the poles, in terms of the magnetic field, is an important... one more thing. It's unknown at this point what causes the magnetic field. There's a lot of speculation that it's caused by some kind of internal differential motion of the core relative to the surface and things like that. But all that is highly speculative. It's as likely that the magnetic field is not caused by the Earth, but is caused by external phenomenon like the sun. And we know this now because the smallest planet in our solar system, Mercury, which is closest to the sun, it's a rock. This thing's a dead planet, we think. We just sent a probe out to Mercury, and we found that it has the strongest magnetic field of all the inner planets. All right? Where is this thing getting its magnetic field from? And there's also evidence that the magnetic field of the Mercury and the sun connect periodically to create a tube of transport of solar material to the surface of Mercury through the magnetic field. So it is a good question of whether or not the magnetic field of the Earth is actually a solar system phenomenon and not generated by the Earth itself, but is generated from the outside and imposed on the Earth. So this comes back to the question, what is up with the Arctic? Why are there so many resources? Why is it a phenomenal place? Why is it the way it is? It's possible that we have to go up there and develop the area to really know. There's a lot of questions. So the mission of humanity is the mission of humanity is not to develop the Arctic. We want to develop the Arctic because our mission is to develop the entire solar system and the universe. We have to get into space, all right? We are a spacefaring creature. Which we found back in the moonshot. Some people in here might be history buffs and got into the Apollo program and figured out, okay, how did the United States get to the moon and so forth. It was an organizing drive, all right? It was an organizing drive particularly by some German scientists who came over to the United States, German rocket scientists, like one of Mr. LaRouche's collaborators, Kraft Erica, came to the United States as part of a program to actually bring rocket scientists over, and began organizing for getting to Mars. It was funny, just as a side note, a lot of these German rocket scientists like Werner von Braun, Kraft Erica, they worked for the Nazis in Germany. The Nazis were renowned for their rocket technology. And the SS, the Waffen-SS, Hitler's core army, kept getting pissed off at the rocket designs that they were seeing from these rocket scientists because they wanted missiles, right? They wanted rockets that were capped with warheads so they could shoot it at England and whoever else. But they kept getting pissed off because they kept seeing little command capsules with people inside the nose cones of the rocket designs. All right? The rocket scientists weren't developing rockets as weapons. They were developing rockets as spaceships to get people into space and to Mars. Every single one of these rocket scientists had as the focus of their attention, how do you get people to Mars? And so when they were in the United States, the organizing was, okay, we will help build rockets, but the mission is to get to Mars. And when President John F. Kennedy declared the Apollo program, it was clear that the mission, he was clear, and he was publicly clear, that the mission wasn't to get to the moon. The mission was to use the moon as a stepping stone towards colonizing the whole solar system, starting with Mars. Now, that project was an organizing drive by a relatively small number of people that took over a government institution and became a reality. We actually did land on the moon, contrary to YouTube. We actually have been there. We have moon rocks. We have the technology to prove it, and we have people that were there. NAWAPA is the same thing. All right, some people look at this project and say, my God, this thing's so big, the British Empire will never let you get away with that. But in reality, the way you do get away with it is, of course, take down the British Empire, but then organize for it. So what is it that we're going to get out of NAWAPA? And by the way, this conference is part of a series of conferences that we've had over the past 2 weeks in the United States. This is the first one that we've had in Canada to drive the concept of NAWAPA and then the associated development of rail lines, nuclear power, etc. The purpose of NAWAPA, you will get out of it instantly 4 million jobs. There will immediately be created 4 million job openings, which doesn't mean that 4 million people will be employed right away. But you'll get that kind of that necessity for work, which means that we can take a large swath of our youth population in Canada, United States, and Mexico and immediately put them to work becoming skilled labor. And not just skilled as in, they know how to dig a hole or they know how to push a computer mouse, but skilled as in they know how to go into the field and figure out how you design a new type of technology in order to fulfill a design of a principle. Skilled labor in the sense that they will have gone into areas that have never been touched before, like the Arctic, and run into problems that couldn't be solved without recognizing that a new principle exists to discover. So you'll develop a mass of skilled labor out of a virtually, no offense, but a virtually unwashed, unshaven mass of youth population that really doesn't know how to do very much at all. All right, our education stank. So we'll get a skilled labor force. We'll learn to solve gigantic problems, like my favorite one is in Alaska. One of the dams that will be constructed for this system is going to be 1,700 feet tall. The Hoover Dam down in the United States is 700 feet tall. So this would be like a 1,000-foot dam on top of the Hoover Dam. And it's also in an area that's been hit by earthquakes that are up to 9 on the Richter scale, which all the ones that have hit like Chile and so forth are about 8, 7, 8.5, things like that. So we have to build the biggest dam in the world essentially on one of the most active fault lines on the planet, which is a big technological challenge. And I've been assured by several top engineers that we can do this kind of thing. So we'll develop a skilled labor force, we'll learn to solve gigantic problems, and we'll send people into an area which is the connecting point between the Earth and the rest of the entire universe. So this is the mission. We've got to destroy the British Empire and send man into space, which is his mission. Yeah, our mission is to go out and garden the universe. Okay. Am I not feeding back now? So anyhow, that's the mission that Mr. LaRouche has laid out. Not just, we organize primarily in the United States, and there's a robust group in Canada here. There's also, pockets throughout Canada. Here's the core. But as a mission for humanity, we have got to free this planet once and for all from empire and establish a system of sovereign nation states which are dedicated to bringing up not just the living standard of the population, but the ability of people to make new discoveries and to colonize the solar system, which means we have to free the world from empire, set up a system of sovereign nation states, and go out into space, finally, past the International Space Station. Right, we have to go to the moon, industrialize it, and get to Mars. And then we will become the active organizing force for the whole universe, which is what our God-given mission is. So that's that. That's the presentation. Now, I think that we have some time for questions for either. All right. Hope you guys liked it. We have some time for questions for either myself or Jean-Philippe.